The grandfather clock in the corner of Thomas Harrison's study ticked loudly, marking each second with a hollow, wooden sound that seemed to echo everyone's heartbeat. 8 people sat in uncomfortable silence, scattered around the room in leather chairs and a worn sofa, all avoiding eye contact. Outside, rain pelted against the windows of the colonial-style house in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, a fitting backdrop for the somber occasion. Martin Wheeler, the family attorney for 30 years, cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he opened the manila folder containing Richard Harrison's last will and testament. The patriarch had passed away 10 days ago after a brief but intense battle with pancreatic cancer, leaving behind a family already fractured before his death. "I'll begin now," Martin said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "As executor of Richard's estate, I'm required to read this document in its entirety before any discussions." Sarah Harrison, Richard's widow, sat rigidly in her husband's favorite armchair. At 68, she maintained the dignified posture of someone who had spent decades as the wife of the town's most successful businessman. Her gray hair was pulled into a neat bun, her face carefully composed despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes. Across from her sat their eldest son, Michael, who at 45 had taken over the family construction business 5 years ago. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the ornate carpet. Next to him, his wife Jessica scrolled through her phone, seemingly disinterested in the proceedings. By the window stood James, the younger son, looking out at the rain. At 42, he had never worked for the family business, choosing instead to move to Boston to pursue a career in architecture. His return for the funeral was the first time he'd been home in nearly 3 years. His husband, David, sat nearby, uncomfortable and out of place among the family he barely knew. On the sofa, Elizabeth, Richard's only daughter, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. At 38, she had always been her father's favorite, working alongside him in the business until a disagreement 2 years ago had driven her away. Her husband had stayed home with their children, claiming they were too young for a funeral. The last person in the room was Richard's sister, Margaret, who at 72 had outlived her brother by just 10 days. Everyone knew she was only there out of obligation and curiosity, having had a strained relationship with Richard for decades. I, Richard James Harrison, being of sound mind and body. Martin began reading the formal opening of the will, while the family members shifted uncomfortably. The standard legal language flowed past until Martin reached the distribution of assets, and the room grew impossibly quieter. "To my beloved wife, Sarah, I leave our family home and its contents, along with a monthly stipend from the Harrison Trust." Martin paused, glancing at Sarah, who nodded slightly, having expected this much. "To my son, Michael, I leave 51% of Harrison Construction, with the expectation that he will continue to grow the company I built." Michael's face remained impassive, though his right hand clenched into a fist. "To my daughter, Elizabeth, I leave 30% of Harrison Construction and my personal collection of architectural books and drawings." Elizabeth looked up sharply, surprise evident on her face. She had expected to be cut out entirely after their falling out. "To my son, James, I leave my vacation property in Maine and 19% of Harrison Construction." James turned from the window, his expression darkening. He had never wanted any part of the business, and this felt like his father's final attempt to pull him back into a world he had rejected. Additionally, Martin continued, his voice slowing slightly, "I leave the sum of $1 million to Jamie Bennett." The name hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's composed expression cracked for the first time, her face paling. Michael stood up abruptly. "Who the hell is Jamie Bennett?" he demanded, looking around the room as if expecting an imposter to be hiding in the corners. Martin cleared his throat. "According to the information I have, Jamie Bennett is Richard's daughter, born in 1985 to Catherine Bennett." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's hands trembled as she gripped the arms of the chair. Elizabeth let out a small gasp, while James turned back to the window, his shoulders tense. "That's impossible," Michael finally said, his voice tight with anger. "Dad would never." "I have the documentation here," Martin interrupted, pulling out a birth certificate from the folder, along with DNA test results that Richard had conducted privately last year. Sarah stood up, her composure completely shattered. Richard had an affair? And a child? Her voice was barely audible. When we were married? Martin nodded uncomfortably. According to these papers, it was in 1984, during the company's expansion to Portland. Richard maintained some contact with Ms. Bennett over the years and had begun the process of amending his will after confirming Jamie's paternity last year. 39 years, Sarah whispered, sinking back into the chair. For 39 years, he kept this secret. The betrayal evident in her voice made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably. Where is this woman now? Elizabeth asked, her voice sharp. Jamie. Does she know about us? She lives in Portland, Oregon, Martin explained. According to Richard's notes, she was informed of her paternity last year, though she has never met any of you. She's been notified of Richard's passing and the contents of the will. Michael paced the room, his face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. We can contest this, right? Some random woman shows up claiming to be Dad's kid after he's dead, and she gets $1 million? While the actual business goes to someone who walked away from it. He shot a venomous look at James. I never wanted the business, James said quietly. You know that. Then why did Dad leave you shares? Michael snapped. 19%? Just enough to cause problems if you and Elizabeth ever decide to team up against me. Elizabeth stood up, her grief momentarily replaced by indignation. Is that all you care about? Control? Dad just died. We just found out we have a half-sister we never knew existed. And you're worried about company politics? Don't pretend you care about family now, Michael retorted. You walked out on Dad when he needed you most. He fired me. Elizabeth's voice rose. Because I dared to suggest. Expanding in directions he didn't approve of. Sarah's quiet voice cut through their argument. Stop it. Both of you. She looked up at Martin. Is there anything else? Martin nodded, clearly uncomfortable. There is one more stipulation. Richard has requested that all 4 of his children, Michael, Elizabeth, James, and Jamie, must attend a family retreat at the main property for 1 weekend before the final transfer of business shares can occur. If any of you refuse to participate, your shares will be redistributed among the others who do attend. The room erupted in protests. Michael's face turned red as he declared the condition manipulative and unfair. Elizabeth sank back into the sofa, covering her face with her hands. James simply shook his head in disbelief. When does this retreat have to happen? Sarah asked, her voice eerily calm amid the chaos. Within 30 days of today's reading, Martin replied. Richard was very specific about the timeline. As the implications sank in, the rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows. The family that had entered the room, already divided, now faced a choice that would either heal their fractures or break them apart completely. And somewhere in Portland, a woman named Jamie Bennett was about to step into a family drama she'd never asked to be part of. /content/invoke. The door slammed behind Michael as he stormed into his own kitchen, his footsteps heavy against the hardwood floor. Jessica looked up from her laptop, her eyebrows raised in silent question. Their modern home on the outskirts of Portsmouth was everything the Harrison family house wasn't. Minimalist, sleek, and devoid of history. Well? She asked, closing her computer. How bad was it? Michael yanked open the refrigerator door and grabbed a beer. Worse than we thought. Dad left 19% of the company to James. 19%. He hasn't shown his face around here in years, and suddenly he gets a chunk of what I've been running. He took a long swig from the bottle, not bothering with a glass. And Elizabeth? 30%. Michael practically spat the words. Which means if she and James team up, they could cause serious problems for me. He slumped into a chair across from his wife. Oh, and apparently I have a half-sister nobody knew about. Dad had an affair in the 80s and left his love child $1 million. Jessica's perfectly manicured nails stopped drumming on the table. You're joking. I wish I was. Michael rubbed his temples. Some woman in Portland. Dad apparently tracked her down last year, confirmed she was his with a DNA test, and changed his will. Your poor mother, Jessica murmured, though her tone suggested she was more interested in the scandal than concerned for Sarah's feelings. This is a nightmare, Michael continued. And the cherry on top? Dad's will says all 4 of us, me, Elizabeth, James, and this Jamie person, have to spend a weekend together at the main house or we lose our shares. Jessica's eyes widened. He can't be serious. Martin says it's binding. We have 30 days. Michael finished his beer in one long gulp. Dad knew exactly what he was doing. He's controlling us from the grave. Across town, Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. Her husband, Tom, was upstairs putting their two children, Emma and Jack, to bed. The modest ranch house they'd purchased after she left Harrison Construction felt especially small tonight, the walls closing in with each passing minute. She scrolled through old photos on her phone, pictures of her and her father at construction sites, at company parties, bent over blueprints together. Elizabeth had been the only one of Richard's children who had truly loved the business the way he did. Michael saw it as a legacy to control. James had rejected it entirely, but for Elizabeth, Harrison Construction had been her passion. Until 2 years ago, the argument played in her mind like a worn-out record. Her father shouting that her ideas for sustainable building practices would bankrupt them. Her insisting that the industry was changing, that they needed to adapt. The final words he'd spoken before firing her. "This is still my company, and as long as I'm alive, we'll do things my way. You okay?" Tom's voice startled her. He slid into the chair beside her, his hand covering hers. "Dad left me 30% of the company," she said quietly. Tom's eyebrows shot up. "Really? After everything that happened?" Elizabeth nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "And there's more. We have a half-sister. Dad had an affair when Mom was pregnant with me." "Jesus," Tom whispered. "How's your mom taking it? How do you think?" Elizabeth wiped her eyes. It's like watching someone's world collapse in slow motion. 46 years of marriage, and she never knew. Tom squeezed her hand. "What are you going to do about the company's shares?" Elizabeth sighed deeply. "I don't know. Michael will expect me to sell them to him. That would be the easiest solution." "But not what you want," Tom observed. "No." Elizabeth's voice strengthened. "Harrison Construction was supposed to be my future too. Dad took that away from me once. I'm not sure I'm ready to give it up again." In a downtown Portsmouth hotel room, James paced back and forth while David watched from the edge of the bed. "I never wanted any part of that business," James said for what felt like the 100th time. "Dad knew that. This is his way of dragging me back, of making me choose between my principles and a payday." David sighed. "You don't have to take it, you know. You could walk away." James stopped pacing. "And let Michael have it all. Let him continue running the company the same way Dad did, cutting corners on environmental regulations, underpaying workers, gentrifying neighborhoods." He shook his head. "I spent my entire career trying to design sustainable buildings because I saw firsthand what Dad's kind of development does to communities." "So what's your plan?" David asked softly. "To use your shares to force changes?" "I don't know." James ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "Elizabeth wanted to make changes too. That's why Dad fired her. Maybe between the two of us. And what about this half-sister? Jamie?" James sat down heavily next to his husband. "I have no idea. She's as much Dad's child as any of us. She deserves to be acknowledged, at least." David placed a hand on James's shoulder. "This weekend retreat thing, are you going to go? Do I have a choice?" James leaned into his husband's touch. "Though I can't imagine what Dad was thinking. Michael, Elizabeth, me, and a stranger in one house for a weekend? It's going to be a disaster." In her modest apartment in Portland, Oregon, Jamie Bennett stared at the formal letter in her hands, reading it for what must have been the 20th time since it had arrived that morning. A check for $50,000, a small advance on her inheritance, was still sitting on her coffee table, untouched. She'd known Richard Harrison was her biological father for exactly 10 months. A lifetime of wondering, followed by a single email that had changed everything. The DNA test had confirmed what her mother had always told her. She was the daughter of a businessman her mother had met during a brief affair. A man who had returned to his pregnant wife and young family on the other side of the country. Jamie had agreed to meet him once, last year. A tense, awkward lunch at a Portland restaurant where Richard had alternated between awkward small talk and explaining his empire, as if trying to offer her a piece of a life she had never been part of. He'd mentioned his other children briefly. Michael, who ran the company, Elizabeth, who had her own ideas about its future, and James, who had walked away from it all. He hadn't offered to introduce her to them, and she hadn't asked. Now Richard was dead, and a lawyer named Martin Wheeler had informed her not only of her inheritance, but of the bizarre stipulation that came with it. A weekend with 3 half-siblings who hadn't known she existed until today. 3 people who had every reason to resent her presence in their lives. Jamie picked up her phone and scrolled to her mother's number. Catherine Bennett had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 3 years ago and now lived in a memory care facility across town. She still had good days, though they were becoming increasingly rare. Jamie visited her 3 times a week, but her mother often didn't recognize her anymore. Putting the phone down without calling, Jamie walked to the window of her small apartment. The Portland rain was relentless tonight, not unlike the thoughts swirling through her mind. As a nurse at Providence Medical Center, she was used to dealing with crises, with making quick decisions in high-pressure situations. But this was different. This was personal in a way nothing in her life had ever been. $1 million would change her life. It would pay off her student loans, provide better care for her mother, maybe even allow her to buy a small house instead of renting. All she had to do was spend one weekend with the family she never knew she had, a family that had just discovered her existence in the most painful way possible. Jamie returned to the couch and picked up the check, running her finger over Richard Harrison's signature. The signature of a man who had acknowledged her existence just long enough to die and leave her with an impossible choice. In the master bedroom of the Harrison family home, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with Richard for nearly 5 decades. The room was exactly as it had been when he was alive, his reading glasses still on the nightstand, his robe hanging on the back of the door, his slippers peeking out from under the bed. She had maintained her composure throughout the reading of the will, had nodded politely as Martin explained the details, had even managed to ask practical questions when all she wanted to do was scream. It was only now, alone in the room where she had built a life with a man she thought she knew, that Sarah allowed herself to feel the full weight of the betrayal. Catherine Bennett, a name she had never heard before today. A woman who had been with her husband while Sarah was pregnant with Elizabeth. A woman who had given birth to Richard's child, a daughter he had secretly acknowledged and provided for. Sarah opened the drawer of Richard's nightstand, searching for something, anything that might explain what he had been thinking. Inside, beneath a stack of prescription bottles and business magazines, she found a small leather-bound notebook she had never seen before. Her hands trembled as she opened it, recognizing Richard's neat, precise handwriting. The first entry was dated a little over a year ago. Confirmed today what I've suspected for years. Jamie is my daughter. DNA doesn't lie. Now I have to decide what to do about it. Sarah read through the sparse entries, each one a knife twisting in her heart. Richard's descriptions of meeting Jamie for the first time, of recognizing features of himself and his mother in her face, of his uncertainty about how to make amends for decades of absence. The final entry, dated just weeks before his diagnosis, read, "Time is the one thing none of us can buy more of. I've wasted too much of it already. With Jamie, with James, with Elizabeth. Sarah will never forgive me for Catherine, but perhaps my children can find a way to be a family after I'm gone. The main house was always where we were happiest. Maybe it can be again." Sarah closed the notebook, her chest tight with grief and anger. Richard had kept this secret for nearly 4 decades, had carried it with him through birthdays and anniversaries, through the births of their grandchildren, through every moment she had believed they were sharing their lives completely. Now he was gone, and she was left with the pieces of a life that felt increasingly like a carefully constructed illusion. And somewhere out there was a woman named Jamie Bennett, who carried Richard's blood but not his name, who was about to walk into a family dynamic she couldn't possibly understand. Sarah placed the notebook back in the drawer and closed it firmly. Richard had made his choices. Now it was time for her to make hers. Content. The first snowfall of the season dusted the trees surrounding the Harrison vacation home in Kennebunkport, Maine. The 2-story cedar and stone structure stood at the edge of a small cove, its large windows reflecting the gray November sky. A wraparound porch, covered in a thin layer of white, stretched across the front and one side of the house, overlooking the turbulent Atlantic Ocean. Michael arrived first, driving his black Range Rover up the long driveway, Jessica beside him scrolling through her phone. He'd insisted on arriving before the others to scope out the situation, or as he put it to Jessica, to make sure everything is in order. In reality, he wanted to claim the best bedroom and establish his presence before his siblings arrived. "I don't know why we couldn't stay at that boutique hotel in town," Jessica complained as they stepped out of the car into the biting coastal wind. "This place hasn't been updated since the 90s. Michael frowned as he retrieved their luggage from the trunk. Because Dad's will specifically said we have to stay here. Together. For the entire weekend. He glanced toward the water, where white-capped waves crashed against the rocky shore. Trust me, I'd rather be anywhere else. Inside, the house was exactly as it had been during the family vacations of his childhood. Knotty pine walls, sturdy rustic furniture, shelves lined with board games and dog-eared paperbacks. The faint scent of wood smoke and salt air brought back memories Michael had spent years trying to forget. He was inspecting the kitchen when the sound of another car pulling into the driveway caught his attention. Through the window, he saw Elizabeth's Subaru parking behind his Range Rover. She emerged alone, pulling a weekend bag from the back seat. "No, Tom?" Michael asked when she entered the kitchen, attempting to keep his tone neutral. Elizabeth shook her head, unwinding a thick scarf from around her neck. "Someone had to stay with the kids. Mom said she would have taken them, but..." She trailed off, both of them aware that Sarah was in no condition to be watching children right now. "James isn't here yet?" Elizabeth asked, glancing around. "Not yet, and no sign of the other one." Elizabeth gave him a sharp look. "Her name is Jamie, Michael. She's our sister." "Half-sister," Michael corrected. "And she's a stranger who's coming to claim a piece of our father's legacy. Don't expect me to roll out the welcome mat." Elizabeth sighed, setting her bag down by the kitchen island. "This is exactly what Dad was afraid would happen. That we'd all dig in our heels and refuse to act like adults." "Don't start with me, Liz," Michael warned. "I've spent the last 5 years running that company while you've been playing house. I've doubled our revenues and expanded into 3 new states. I'm not going to apologize for protecting what I've built." "What you've built?" Elizabeth's voice rose slightly. "Dad fired me because I suggested we implement sustainable building practices. Because I dared to think beyond the bottom line. Now the entire industry is moving in that direction, and Harrison Construction is falling behind." Before Michael could respond, the sound of a third car pulling up interrupted them. Through the window, they saw James and David stepping out of a rental car, both dressed in stylish winter coats unsuited for Maine weather. "Great," Michael muttered. "The prodigal son returns." Elizabeth shot him another warning look before moving to open the front door. "Be nice, Michael. For once in your life, try not to make everything worse." James entered with a tentative smile, David following close behind. "Hey, Liz," he said, giving his sister a brief hug. "It's good to see you." "You too," Elizabeth replied, genuine warmth in her voice despite the tension permeating the house. "Hi, David. Thanks for coming." David nodded, clearly uncomfortable. "James wouldn't have come without me." Michael appeared in the hallway, arms crossed over his chest. "James," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "David." "Michael." James's smile faded. "Still dressing like a Brooks Brothers mannequin? I see." "Still dressing like you're at a coffee shop poetry slam? I see," Michael retorted. Elizabeth stepped between them. "Can we at least get through the first 5 minutes without sniping at each other? Please." An uncomfortable silence fell over the group, broken only by the sound of the wind picking up outside. The 4 of them stood awkwardly in the entryway, years of unspoken grievances and divergent life paths creating an almost tangible barrier. "I made up beds in all the usual rooms," Michael finally said. "Jessica and I took Mom and Dad's old room." James nodded, reaching for his bag. "David and I can take my old room." "I'll go up to mine too," Elizabeth said. "We should probably settle in before." She didn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what she meant. Before Jamie arrived. Before they had to face the reality of their father's secret life. As they moved toward the stairs, a 4th car could be heard pulling up the driveway. "Sounds like she's here," Michael said, his voice tight. They gathered at the front window, watching as a woman emerged from a rental car. Jamie Bennett was average height with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore jeans, boots, and a practical winter coat. Nothing like the fancy attire Jessica had chosen for the weekend or the designer clothes Michael favored. She stood for a moment beside her car, staring up at the house with an expression that mixed apprehension and determination. "She looks like Dad," James said quietly. "Around the eyes." "She looks like Grandma Helen," Elizabeth corrected. "That's Dad's mother in her face." Michael said nothing, his expression unreadable as he watched the stranger who shared their blood approach the house. When she reached the porch, he stepped away from the window, gesturing for Elizabeth to answer the door. This is your idea, he said. You deal with it. Elizabeth squared her shoulders and moved to open the door. Jamie stood on the threshold, snowflakes melting in her dark hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Hi, she said, her voice steady despite the visible tension in her posture. I'm Jamie Bennett. Elizabeth Harrison. Elizabeth responded, extending her hand. Please, come in. Jamie stepped inside, taking in the three siblings and David with a quick, assessing glance. Her eyes, a shade of green that did indeed echo their late grandmother's, moved from face to face before settling on Elizabeth. Thank you for having me, she said, though they all knew none of them had actually chosen this arrangement. I understand this is uncomfortable. That's one word for it, Michael muttered, earning an elbow in the ribs from Jessica. I'm Michael, he said, making no move to shake Jamie's hand. This is my wife, Jessica. Jessica offered a tight smile. Lovely to meet you. And I'm James. James stepped forward, extending his hand. This is my husband, David. Nice to meet you all, Jamie said, shaking James's hand. Her voice was calm, professional, the voice of someone used to navigating difficult situations. I want to be clear about something right away. I'm not here to disrupt your lives or claim anything beyond what your father chose to leave me. I never asked for any of this. None of us did, Michael replied coldly. Yet here we are. An awkward silence fell over the group, broken only by the sound of the wind whistling around the eaves of the old house. I showed everyone to their rooms already, Elizabeth said, attempting to ease the tension. There's one more upstairs at the end of the hall. It has a nice view of the ocean. Thank you, Jamie said, reaching for her bag. I'll just go get settled then. As Jamie climbed the stairs, the four Harrison family members and their spouses exchanged glances. This is insane, Michael said quietly. What was Dad thinking? He was thinking we needed to acknowledge that we're all connected, whether we like it or not, James replied. He may have made a mess of things, but at least he tried to clean it up before the end. By forcing us all together in this house. Michael scoffed. That's not cleaning up a mess. That's making it worse. Elizabeth sighed, looking between her brothers. Can we at least agree to be civil? For one weekend? I know you're angry, Michael. We all have reasons to be angry with Dad. But Jamie isn't to blame for any of this. I'm not promising anything, Michael said, turning away. I'm here because I have to be. That doesn't mean I have to like it. As the day progressed, the members of the fractured Harrison family moved cautiously around one another, like strangers sharing a too small space. Elizabeth took charge of the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner from the groceries that had been delivered earlier. James and David went for a walk along the shore, despite the cold wind. Michael and Jessica retreated to their bedroom, where Michael spent hours on his phone, handling work calls he insisted couldn't wait until Monday. Jamie remained in her room for nearly 2 hours before emerging. She joined Elizabeth in the kitchen, quietly offering to help. I'm not much of a cook, she admitted, but I can chop vegetables or set the table. Elizabeth handed her a stack of plates. The dining room is through there. The table should already be set up. As Jamie arranged the plates around the large oak table, she studied the family photos lining the walls. There were pictures of Richard and Sarah, much younger, surrounded by 3 small children on this very beach. Pictures of family Christmases, graduations, weddings. A visual history of a family she had never been part of. That was Michael's high school graduation, Elizabeth said, entering with a handful of silverware. She pointed to a photo of Richard with his arm around a teenage Michael in a cap and gown. Dad was so proud that day. Michael was valedictorian. Jamie nodded, unsure what to say. Her own high school graduation had been attended by her mother and her mother's sister, in a crowded gym in Portland. No father to cheer as she received her diploma. It must be strange for you, Elizabeth continued, setting out napkins. Seeing all this history you weren't part of. A little, Jamie admitted. But I had my own life, my own history. My mom did her best. How is she? Elizabeth asked. Your mother? Jamie's expression clouded. She has Alzheimer's. Early onset. She's in a care facility now. I'm sorry, Elizabeth said, genuine sympathy in her voice. That must be difficult. It is, Jamie agreed. But we manage. The inheritance, it will help with her care. That's mainly why I'm here, to be honest. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. Did you know about us? Growing up, I mean. Jamie shook her head. Not specifically. My mom told me my father was a businessman who already had a family. That was all. I didn't know his name until last year, when he contacted me. And how did that happen? Elizabeth asked, unable to hide her curiosity. How did he find you? He didn't, Jamie replied, folding a napkin with careful precision. I found him. My mom's condition was worsening, and I wanted to know my medical history before it was too late to ask. I hired a private investigator and submitted my DNA to one of those ancestry websites. Eventually, it led to Richard. Before Elizabeth could respond, Michael's voice interrupted from the doorway. So you tracked him down for his money? Jamie's head snapped up, her expression hardening. No, I tracked him down because I wanted to know who I was, where I came from. The money was his idea, not mine. How convenient, Michael said, his tone dripping with skepticism. Michael, Elizabeth warned. Don't. What? Michael stepped fully into the dining room. We're all thinking it. She shows up in Dad's life just before he gets sick, and suddenly she's in his will? You don't find that suspicious? Jamie's calm demeanor cracked slightly, a flash of anger crossing her face. I'm a nurse practitioner. I make a good living. I didn't need your father's money. I needed answers. But since you seem so concerned about it, yes, the inheritance will help with my mother's care. And if that bothers you so much, I'd be happy to sign my portion over to a charity of your choice. The challenge in her voice seemed to catch Michael off guard. Before he could respond, James and David returned from their walk, bringing a blast of cold air and much-needed interruption to the brewing confrontation. It's freezing out there, James announced, removing his gloves. But beautiful. The waves are incredible. He stopped short, sensing the tension in the room. What did we miss? Nothing, Elizabeth said quickly. Dinner's almost ready. Everyone should get washed up. As they awkwardly dispersed, Jamie remained by the table, her hands gripping the back of a chair, knuckles white. The weekend had barely begun, and already it was clear that Richard Harrison's dying wish for family reconciliation was going to be far more difficult to fulfill than any of them had anticipated. Content. Dinner was served at 7. The roast chicken and vegetables Elizabeth had prepared arranged on Richard Harrison's antique blue willow plates. The 6 of them sat around the oak dining table, the empty chair at the head, Richard's place, standing as a silent reminder of why they were there. Outside, the first real snowstorm of the season had arrived, wind howling around the eaves of the old house, waves crashing against the rocky shoreline below. For the first 10 minutes, the only sounds were the clink of silverware against china and the occasional murmur of, "Please pass the salt," or "This is delicious, Elizabeth." Michael kept his eyes on his plate, cutting his food with mechanical precision. Jessica sipped her wine too frequently, glancing at her watch every few minutes as if counting down the hours until they could leave. James and David exchanged meaningful looks, while Elizabeth valiantly attempted to generate conversation. The forecast says the storm might last through tomorrow morning, she offered, but it should clear up by afternoon. Great, Michael muttered, trapped in this house even longer. Elizabeth shot him a warning look before turning to Jamie. Did you have a long drive from Portland? Jamie set down her fork. About 2 hours. The rental car company upgraded me because of the weather forecast. Smart of them, James commented. These coastal roads can get treacherous during storms. Uncomfortable silence fell again, broken only when Jessica reached for the wine bottle to refill her glass. David cleared his throat. So, Jamie, Elizabeth mentioned you're a nurse practitioner? Jamie nodded, seeming grateful for the question. Yes, at Providence Medical Center. I work in the oncology department. That must be difficult, Elizabeth said sympathetically. It can be, Jamie acknowledged. But rewarding too. I've always wanted to help people. Michael snorted softly, earning a sharp look from his wife. What about the rest of you? Jamie asked, her voice carefully neutral. I know a little about the family business, but not much else. Michael runs Harrison Construction now, Elizabeth explained. He took over from Dad 5 years ago, though Dad remained chairman until... She trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. And you? Jamie asked, looking at Elizabeth. I worked there too, until a couple of years ago, Elizabeth replied, glancing briefly at Michael. Now I do freelance architectural consulting, mostly sustainable building projects. She got fired, Michael said flatly, for trying to push her agenda against Dad's wishes. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed. My agenda? was trying to move the company into the 21st century. The industry is changing, Michael. Clients want green buildings now. Clients want buildings that come in on budget and on time, Michael countered. All that sustainable stuff sounds great until they see the price tag. That's not true anymore, James interjected. The cost gap has narrowed significantly. The firm I work for in Boston specializes in sustainable design, and we're booked solid for the next 3 years. Michael turned to his younger brother, his expression hardening. Well, isn't that nice for you? Meanwhile, some of us have been actually running the family business instead of criticizing it from afar. I left because I couldn't stand watching Dad destroy communities to build luxury condos nobody could afford. James shot back. At least I stood by my principles. Your principles? Michael scoffed. Easy to have principles when you're not the one responsible for 100 employees' livelihoods. Stop it, Elizabeth snapped. Both of you. This is exactly why Dad set up this ridiculous weekend. Because we can't be in the same room for 5 minutes without fighting. An awkward silence fell over the table. Jamie looked between the siblings, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she spoke quietly. He talked about all of you, when we met last year. All eyes turned to her. What did he say? Elizabeth asked, her voice barely audible over the wind outside. Jamie set down her wine glass. He said he was proud of all of you, in different ways. He said Michael had a head for business that reminded him of himself when he was younger. He said Elizabeth had vision that he sometimes lacked. And he said James had conviction that he admired, even when they disagreed. Michael's jaw tightened. If he was so proud, why did he set up this situation? Forcing us all together, dangling the company's shares like a carrot? I think he was trying to fix things, Jamie replied. In his own way. He knew he was running out of time. And what about you? Michael demanded. What did he say about his secret daughter? Jamie met his gaze steadily. He said he regretted not knowing me sooner. That he'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone, but he wanted to make it right. By throwing money at the problem? Michael's voice was cold. That was always Dad's solution. It wasn't about the money, Jamie said, a hint of irritation finally breaking through her calm demeanor. Not for me, anyway. It was about answers. About knowing where I came from. And what about your mother? Jessica asked, the wine making her bolder. Was it about the money for her? Jamie's expression hardened. My mother worked 2 jobs to raise me alone. She never asked your father for a dime. She didn't even tell him she was pregnant. Then why now? Michael pressed. Why after all these years did you suddenly track him down? I told you already, Jamie replied, her patience visibly wearing thin. My mother's illness. I needed to know my medical history. And she was starting to forget things, important things. I wanted to know the truth while she could still tell me. Elizabeth placed her napkin on the table. What was she like? Your mother? The question seemed to catch Jamie off guard. She paused, considering. Strong, she finally said. Independent. She worked as a paralegal for most of my childhood. She loved music. She played piano at church on Sundays. She never said a bad word about your father, even when I asked why he wasn't in our lives. And what did she tell you? James asked quietly. That he had another family. That he had made his choice, and she respected it. Jamie's voice grew softer. She always told me I was wanted, that she had chosen to have me on her own. It wasn't until I was older that I realized how hard it must have been for her. The room fell silent again, the weight of the past settling over them like the snow accumulating outside. The contrast between their privileged upbringing and Jamie's more modest one hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. He left her this, Jamie said suddenly, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a small velvet pouch. From it, she extracted a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny sailboat. Apparently he gave it to her during their time together. She kept it all these years. When he came to see me, he recognized it immediately. Elizabeth reached out hesitantly, and Jamie placed the bracelet in her palm. Dad had this same charm on his key ring, Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. I never knew why. He told me it was because they met near the water, Jamie explained. In Portland, there was a sailing regatta happening. Michael pushed his chair back abruptly, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. I don't need to hear about their romantic meetup, he said harshly. I don't care how it happened. The fact is, he cheated on our mother while she was pregnant. Nothing excuses that. I'm not trying to excuse it, Jamie replied, her voice steady despite Michael's outburst. I'm just telling you what I know. Well, I don't want to know. Michael stood up. This whole thing is a farce. Dad manipulated us our entire lives, and he's still doing it from the grave. Michael, Elizabeth began, but he cut her off. No, Liz. I'm done playing along with this. Dad had no right to force this stranger into our lives. He had no right to give her $1 million that should have gone to his real family. And he had no right to make us sit through this charade to keep our shares. Jamie's composure finally broke. I didn't ask for any of this, she said, rising to her feet as well. I don't want your money. I don't want your company's shares. I just wanted to know where I came from. And maybe, just maybe, to understand why my father never wanted to know me until it was too late. Her voice cracked on the last words, and for a moment, the resemblance to Richard Harrison was startlingly clear. The same stubborn set of the jaw, the same intensity in her eyes when provoked. I think I'll turn in early, Jamie said, regaining control. Thank you for dinner, Elizabeth. She left the dining room, her footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. The remaining 5 sat in uncomfortable silence until Jessica spoke, her words slightly slurred from the wine. Well, that went well. Shut up, Jess, Michael snapped. Don't talk to her like that, Elizabeth said firmly. This isn't her fault. It's not Jamie's fault either. The only person to blame for this situation is Dad, and he's not here to answer for it. Convenient for him, Michael muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. James stood up, placing his napkin on the table. I'm going to check on Jamie, he announced. You should be ashamed of yourself, Michael. Me? Michael's voice rose. I'm the one keeping this family together. I'm the one who stayed and worked with Dad when you both abandoned ship. You stayed because it served your ambition, James retorted. Not out of any sense of family loyalty. That's not fair, Elizabeth interjected. Michael has worked hard at the company. Oh, now you're defending him? James asked incredulously. I'm not taking sides, Elizabeth said, her voice tired. I'm just saying this isn't as simple as you're making it out to be. David, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke up. Maybe we should all take a breath. It's been a long day, and emotions are running high. Michael drained his wine glass. Fine. This day couldn't end soon enough anyway. As they began clearing the table, the wind outside intensified, rattling the windows of the old house. The storm was picking up, trapping the fractured Harrison family together for at least another day. Exactly as Richard had planned. Content, morning arrived with a muffled silence that only comes after heavy snowfall. The storm had blown itself out sometime before dawn, leaving nearly a foot of pristine white covering the landscape around the Harrison vacation home. The ocean beyond the cliffs was steel gray and still churning, but the sky had cleared to a brilliant winter blue that promised a beautiful, if cold, day ahead. Jamie woke early, having slept poorly. The guest room she'd been assigned was comfortable enough, with its pine furniture and nautical-themed quilts, but the weight of the previous evening's confrontation had made true rest impossible. She stood at the window now, watching as the rising sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered yard, feeling more alone than she had in years. A soft knock at her door startled her. Jamie? It's Elizabeth. I've made coffee if you'd like some. Jamie hesitated before opening the door. Elizabeth stood in the hallway, already dressed in jeans and a thick sweater, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. I thought you might be awake, she said, offering one of the mugs. I'm an early riser too. Thank you, Jamie said, accepting the coffee. She stepped back, silently inviting Elizabeth into the room. Elizabeth entered, moving to the window to look out at the view. It's beautiful after a storm, isn't it? When we were kids, Dad would wake us all up early after a big snow and take us sledding on that hill over there. She pointed to a gentle slope that led down toward the water. Michael always wanted to go fastest. James always built the most elaborate sled run, and I was usually just trying to keep up with both of them. Jamie sipped her coffee, unsure how to respond to these memories of a childhood she hadn't shared. I'm sorry about last night, Elizabeth continued. Michael can be difficult, especially when it comes to Dad. You don't need to apologize for him, Jamie replied. I understand this is hard for all of you. Elizabeth turned from the window to face her. Did you bring anything with you? Photos of your mother, maybe? I'd like to see her, if you wouldn't mind. Jamie was surprised by the request, but nodded. She retrieved her phone from the nightstand and scrolled through until she found a photo taken about 4 years ago, before her mother's condition had significantly deteriorated. Catherine Bennett stood in a garden, smiling at the camera, her dark hair streaked with gray, her eyes, the same shape and color as Jamie's, bright with life. "She's beautiful," Elizabeth said softly, studying the image. "I can see why Dad was drawn to her." Jamie felt a sudden tightness in her throat. She was the strongest person I've ever known. Still is, in many ways, even with the Alzheimer's. She never complained about how hard things were, raising me alone. And she never reached out to Dad? For child support or anything? Jamie shook her head. She was too proud. She said she made her choice knowing what it meant. Elizabeth handed the phone back, her expression thoughtful. "Can I show you something? It's downstairs in Dad's study." Curious, Jamie followed Elizabeth down the creaking wooden staircase. The house was quiet. Apparently, they were the only ones awake yet. Elizabeth led her to a small room off the main living area, a space lined with bookshelves and dominated by an old roll-top desk positioned to overlook the ocean. "This was Dad's private space," Elizabeth explained, opening one of the desk drawers. "None of us were allowed in here when we were growing up. It was his sanctuary when family vacations got too chaotic." She removed a leather-bound journal and handed it to Jamie. "I found this last night after everyone went to bed. I couldn't sleep, so I came down here looking for, I don't know what. Answers, maybe." Jamie hesitated before accepting the journal. "Should I be reading this? It seems private." "It's about you, mostly," Elizabeth said quietly. "About your mother. I think Dad would want you to have it." Heart racing, Jamie opened the journal to the first page. The date at the top was from nearly 40 years ago, around the time of her conception. The handwriting was neat, precise, and somehow familiar even though she'd never seen it before. "I'll give you some privacy," Elizabeth said, moving toward the door. "Take your time." Alone in Richard Harrison's study, Jamie began to read. The journal entries were sporadic at first, brief mentions of a woman named Catherine he'd met during a business trip to Portland, descriptions of sailing together, of conversations about books and music, of a connection that had caught him by surprise. Then, an entry that made Jamie's hands tremble. "August 15th, 1984, I ended things with Catherine today. The Portland project is wrapping up, and I'm needed back in Portsmouth. Sarah is 7 months pregnant with our third child. I can't do this anymore. The deception, the guilt. Catherine took it better than I deserved. She said she understood, that she'd known from the beginning this couldn't last. I gave her the silver bracelet with the sailboat charm as a poor excuse for a goodbye. I feel like I'm leaving part of myself behind." The entries stopped after that, resuming years later with mentions of business deals, family milestones, occasional reflections on his children's growth. There was no mention of Catherine again until an entry dated just over a year ago, October 3rd, 2023. "A woman contacted me today, claiming to be my daughter. Jamie Bennett, Catherine's daughter. She looks so much like my mother it took my breath away. DNA test scheduled for next week, but I already know what it will show. All these years, I've had a daughter I never knew. What kind of man does that make me?" Subsequent entries documented Richard's struggle with the knowledge of Jamie's existence, his determination to make amends, and his growing awareness of his own mortality even before his cancer diagnosis. December 18th, 2023. Met with Jamie today. She's remarkable, intelligent, composed, compassionate. She works as a nurse, helping cancer patients. The irony isn't lost on me. Catherine raised her well, without any help from me. Jamie doesn't seem interested in my money, only in knowing her history. I have so much to make up for, and so little time. Jamie wiped tears from her cheeks as she continued reading. The final entries, written after Richard's diagnosis, detailed his plans for the inheritance, his hope that his children might find a way to connect, and his regrets about the past. February 28th, 2024. Updated my will today. Martin thinks I'm creating a disaster, forcing the children together like this. Perhaps I am, but I've spent too many years watching my family drift apart. Michael consumed by the business. Elizabeth pushed away because I couldn't see her vision. James rejecting everything I built. And Jamie, who never had a chance to know any of us. Maybe it's selfish, this last attempt to forge connections, but it's all I have left to give them. This chance to know each other, to perhaps find in each other what they couldn't find in me. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks before Richard's death, April 12th, 2024. The doctors say it won't be long now. I've made peace with what's coming, but not with what I'm leaving behind. A fractured family. A lifetime of secrets and mistakes. Sarah will never forgive me once she learns about Catherine and Jamie, and I can't blame her. I only hope that someday my children will understand that even a flawed man can love deeply, if imperfectly. Jamie closed the journal, overwhelmed. She sat in Richard Harrison's chair, looking out at the ocean he had loved, trying to reconcile the man in these pages with the absent father of her childhood. She was still sitting there when a voice from the doorway startled her. "What are you doing in here?" Michael stood watching her, his expression dark with suspicion. "Elizabeth showed me this," Jamie said, holding up the journal. "Your father, he wrote about my mother. About me." Michael's jaw tightened. "So now you're going through his private things?" "I didn't, Michael. I gave her the journal." Elizabeth appeared behind her brother. "She has a right to know what Dad wrote about her." "And what about what he wrote about us?" "About Mom," Michael demanded. "Are those her private thoughts to rummage through too?" "There's very little about your mother in here," Jamie said quietly. "Mostly it's about his regrets. His hopes for all of you." "Spare me," Michael said bitterly. "Dad was great at saying the right things when it was too late to matter." "That's not fair." James's voice joined the conversation as he appeared in the hallway. "Dad tried to connect with you constantly. You were the one who was always too busy." "Because I was running his company." Michael's voice rose. "Someone had to. While you were off building your perfect life in Boston, and Liz was pushing her green agenda." "Stop it, all of you," Elizabeth interjected. "This is exactly what Dad was trying to prevent with this weekend." "No," Michael countered. "This is exactly what he created with his manipulations. Setting us against each other for his shares. Forcing us to play nice with his secret daughter." "I don't want any part of your company," Jamie said firmly, rising from the chair. "I've told you that. I'm here because it was important to him, and because—" She hesitated. "Because what?" James prompted gently. Jamie looked around at the three siblings, these strangers who shared her blood. "Because I spent my entire life wondering who my father was. And part of me hoped that by meeting you, I might find some answers." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room, broken only when David appeared, looking concerned. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, taking in the tense tableau. "Fine," Michael said curtly. "Just discovering more of Dad's secrets." James moved to stand beside Jamie, a subtle gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed by Michael or Elizabeth. "Taking her side already?" Michael asked his brother, his tone caustic. "There aren't sides here, Michael," James replied. "We're all dealing with Dad's choices in our own ways." "Easy for you to say," Michael shot back. "You walked away from all of it years ago. You don't have to live with the consequences." "That's what this is really about, isn't it?" Elizabeth interjected. "Not Jamie or Dad's will. It's about the choices we've all made. You're angry because James left, because I challenged Dad's vision for the company, because we didn't fall in line with what you and Dad wanted." Michael's expression hardened. "What I wanted was a family that stuck together. What I wanted was for both of you to care about what Dad built as much as I did." "We cared," James said quietly. "We just cared about different things. I couldn't be part of a company that put profit above everything else. Liz couldn't stand by while the industry changed, and we stood still." "And what about now?" Elizabeth asked. "The company is struggling, Michael. You know it is. Our bids are coming in too high because we're still using outdated methods. Our competitors are outmaneuvering us on every front." "So that's what this is? A corporate takeover?" Michael laughed bitterly. "You and James using your shares to force me out? Is that what Dad wanted?" "No," Jamie said suddenly, all eyes turning to her. "According to this," she held up the journal, "what he wanted was for all of you to find a way forward together. To use your different strengths instead of seeing them as threats." Michael stared at her, his expression unreadable. "And where do you fit into this grand vision?" Jamie met his gaze steadily. "I don't know. That's for all of you to decide. But I do know one thing. Your father regretted not being the man he wanted to be. For any of us. Including you, Michael." Something flickered in Michael's eyes. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. But before he could respond, Jessica appeared in the doorway, still in her silk pajamas, looking confused by the gathering. "What's going on?" she asked, stifling a yawn. "Why is everyone up so early?" "Family meeting," Michael replied, his voice tight. "Apparently we're all supposed to have some big reconciliation and live happily ever after, just like Dad planned." "Michael," Elizabeth began, but he cut her off. No, Liz. I'm done. He turned to Jamie. Keep the journal. Keep the money. Hell, keep the family name if you want it. But don't expect me to play along with Dad's final manipulation. He stalked out of the room, Jessica trailing behind him with a bewildered expression. The others stood in uncomfortable silence until James spoke. He'll cool down eventually. He always does. Does he? Elizabeth sounded skeptical. Or does he just bottle it up until the next explosion? Jamie looked down at the journal in her hands, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a family drama that had been unfolding long before she arrived. Maybe I should go, she said quietly. This was a mistake. No, Elizabeth said firmly. Dad wanted us all here for a reason. And I think, she glanced at the journal, that we're just beginning to understand what that reason was. Outside, the sun continued to rise over the snow-covered landscape, casting the Harrison family home in a golden light that belied the storm still raging within its walls/content by midday. The tension in the Harrison vacation home had reached a breaking point. Michael and Jessica had retreated to their bedroom, the occasional sound of Michael's raised voice on business calls filtering through the closed door. Elizabeth busied herself in the kitchen, stress baking as she had always done during family crises. James and David ventured outside to clear a path from the house to the cars, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the emotional chaos inside. Jamie sat alone on the porch, bundled in her coat against the cold, watching the brothers work. The journal lay open in her lap, though she had stopped reading it, overwhelmed by the glimpses into Richard Harrison's private thoughts. Mind if I join you? Jamie looked up to find Elizabeth standing at the porch door, carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. Please, Jamie said, shifting to make room on the weathered bench. Elizabeth handed her a mug and sat down, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. You'll freeze out here. I needed some air, Jamie explained. It was getting a bit intense inside. Elizabeth nodded, watching as James and David worked, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. They're good together, she observed. James and David. They've been married for 5 years, but they've been together since college. Dad had a hard time with it at first, but he came around eventually. Jamie sipped her hot chocolate. Your father seems to have been a complicated man. That's one way to put it. Elizabeth agreed with a small smile. Stubborn, controlling, sometimes impossible to please, but also capable of great kindness when you least expected it. She paused. I'm sorry you didn't get to know that side of him sooner. Jamie was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you hate me? Jamie's question was direct, her gaze steady. For existing. For being the product of your father's infidelity. Elizabeth looked surprised. No, she said without hesitation. None of this is your fault. If anything, you're as much a victim of Dad's choices as any of us. She hesitated. I can't speak for Michael, obviously. He's taking this the hardest. Why is that, do you think? Jamie asked. Why is he so much angrier than you or James? Elizabeth considered the question. Michael was always Dad's heir apparent. From the time he was little, it was assumed he would take over the business someday. He patterned his entire life after Dad's, went to the same college, married a woman from the right social circle, even dresses like him. She glanced at the house. Finding out Dad had this whole other life, this secret daughter. I think it shakes the foundation of everything Michael believed about him. And about himself, Jamie added softly. Elizabeth nodded. Exactly. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching as James and David finished clearing the path to the cars and began playfully throwing snowballs at each other. I've been thinking, Elizabeth said finally, about what Dad was trying to accomplish with this weekend. It wasn't just about forcing us to acknowledge you, though that was part of it. I think he genuinely believed we could be stronger together than apart. The business, you mean? The business, the family, all of it. Elizabeth turned to face Jamie. You were right about what you said this morning. We all have different strengths. Michael is brilliant at the operational side of things. Budgets, timelines, managing people. I have a vision for where the industry is heading and how we need to adapt. James has principles that could help us build a more ethical company. And where do I fit in? Jamie asked, echoing Michael's earlier question. Elizabeth smiled. I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out. Before Jamie could respond, the front door opened, and Michael stepped onto the porch. He looked between the two women, his expression guarded. Am I interrupting? Not at all, Elizabeth said. We were just talking about Dad. Michael hesitated, then leaned against the porch railing, his back to the ocean. I've been on the phone with Martinson Construction all morning. They've made an offer to buy us out. Elizabeth straightened. You can't be serious. Dead serious, Michael replied. Their offer is fair. More than fair, actually. We'd all walk away with a nice payout. And all of Dad's work would disappear, Elizabeth said, her voice rising. Everything he built, just gone. Everything he built is already fracturing, Michael countered. We're losing bids to more innovative companies. Our profit margins are shrinking, and now our ownership structure is a mess. He glanced at Jamie. No offense. None taken, Jamie said quietly. James and David approached the porch, having overheard the conversation. You're selling the company? James asked, brushing snow from his coat. Without consulting us. I'm considering an offer, Michael clarified. And I'm consulting you now. After you've already practically agreed to it, Elizabeth accused. Michael ran a hand through his hair in frustration. What would you have me do, Liz? The company is in trouble. You know it, I know it. We're stuck in the past while our competitors move forward. So let's move forward too, Elizabeth urged. Let's implement the changes I've been pushing for years. Sustainable practices, innovative designs. With what capital? Michael interrupted. The changes you want would require completely retooling our approach, retraining our workforce, investing in new materials and methods. We're already operating on thin margins. I might have a solution, James said unexpectedly. All eyes turned to him. My firm in Boston has been looking to expand into New Hampshire. A partnership could give Harrison Construction the innovation boost it needs without starting from scratch. Michael looked skeptical. Your firm would want controlling interest. Not necessarily, James countered. They respect the Harrison name and reputation. It would be a true merger, combining their innovation with our established presence. A thoughtful silence fell over the group. Jamie watched the siblings, sensing a subtle shift in the dynamic. The first hint of them working together rather than against each other. It could work, Elizabeth said slowly. We could maintain Dad's legacy while evolving the company. Michael's expression remained doubtful. And the ownership structure? Between the three of us, plus Jamie's million, plus whatever your firm wants, it's complicated. Actually, Jamie interjected, I've been thinking about that. She took a deep breath. I don't want the cash inheritance. What? Elizabeth looked shocked. I want to honor your father's wishes, Jamie explained. But taking $1 million from a family business that's struggling doesn't feel right. Especially when that business is part of his legacy to you. What are you suggesting? Michael asked cautiously. Convert my inheritance into a small share of the company, Jamie proposed. Not enough to interfere with your decisions, but enough to give me a connection to the Harrison name. And enough to help fund the sustainable initiatives Elizabeth wants. The siblings exchanged surprised glances. You do that? James asked. Invest in a company you know nothing about? Jamie smiled slightly. I know it was built by a man who, despite his flaws, cared enough to try to make things right in the end. Besides, she added, I'm not completely unfamiliar with business. I've been managing my mother's care and her finances since her diagnosis. I understand investment and risk. Michael studied her with new interest. And what would you expect in return? A role in the company? A seat on the board? Information, Jamie replied simply. About Richard Harrison. About the family I never knew. And perhaps, eventually, a relationship with all of you. Whatever form that might take. The straightforward honesty of her answer seemed to catch Michael off guard. For the first time since her arrival, something in his expression softened. I need to think about this, he said finally. About all of it. The offer from Martinson, James's partnership idea, your proposal. He glanced at his watch. Jessica and I were planning to leave after lunch, but maybe we should stay the full weekend after all. As Dad intended. It wasn't an acceptance, but it wasn't a rejection either. Elizabeth caught Jamie's eye, a small smile playing at her lips. I made lasagna, she said. Dad's favorite. It'll be ready in about 20 minutes. As they filed back into the house, the atmosphere had subtly shifted. The tension hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more productive, the tentative beginning of a new understanding. In the kitchen, as Elizabeth pulled the lasagna from the oven and James set the table, Michael surprised everyone by opening a bottle of wine he'd found in Richard's collection. Dad was saving this for a special occasion, he explained, examining the label. A 1984 Bordeaux. Jamie froze. 1984. Michael nodded, a flicker of recognition passing over his face. The year you were born. He poured 6 glasses, passing them around until everyone held one. For a moment, no one spoke, the significance of the vintage hanging in the air between them. Then Michael cleared his throat. To Dad, he said, raising his glass, who, for all his faults, somehow managed to get us all in the same room one last time. To Richard, Jamie echoed softly. They drank, the rich wine warming them from within. Outside, the winter sun had begun its early descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The wind had died down completely, leaving a perfect stillness over the landscape. There's something else, Elizabeth said, setting down her glass. Something I found in Dad's desk this morning after Jamie showed me the journal. She pulled a thick envelope from her pocket. It's addressed to all of us. She opened it carefully, unfolding several pages of Richard Harrison's distinctive handwriting. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before his death. To my children, Elizabeth read aloud. If you're reading this, then Martin has carried out my final request, and you're all together at the main house. I know this weekend won't be easy. There are too many years of misunderstanding between you. Too many words left unsaid. Elizabeth's voice wavered slightly as she continued. Michael, you have your grandfather's head for business and my own determination. But don't let the company become your whole life as I did. It cost me too much, time with your mother, with all of you, and the chance to know Jamie from the beginning. Michael looked down at his wine glass, his expression unreadable. Elizabeth, your vision for the future is clearer than mine ever was. I was wrong to dismiss your ideas. Innovation isn't just about building higher or faster. It's about building better, more responsibly. Don't lose that vision, even when others can't see it yet. Elizabeth blinked back tears as she read her father's words. James, your principles have always been your strength, even when they led you away from the path I wanted for you. You were right to question our methods, to demand we do better. The company and your siblings need that perspective more than ever now. James squeezed David's hand under the table, visibly moved. And Jamie, Elizabeth continued, her voice softer now. The daughter I found too late. Your existence was born of my greatest mistake, but you yourself are not a mistake. You are a Harrison, whether you choose to use the name or not. I hope that in coming to know your siblings, you might find some of what I failed to give you over the years. Jamie wiped a tear from her cheek, overwhelmed by these words from a father she had barely known. Together, Elizabeth read the final paragraph. You have everything needed to continue the Harrison legacy, not just the business, but the values that should have guided it all along: integrity, innovation, compassion, and family. I ask you to try, just for this weekend, to see in each other what I see in all of you. It's my final request, not as your father or boss, but simply as a man hoping his children might find in each other the strength and connection I was too flawed to provide. With love and regret, Richard Harrison. Silence fell over the dining room as Elizabeth carefully folded the letter and returned it to its envelope. No one seemed to know what to say, each lost in their own thoughts about the man who had brought them together one last time. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice unexpectedly gentle. He always did like to have the last word. A ripple of surprised laughter broke the tension. Even Jessica smiled, although she had barely known Richard. So, James said, looking around the table. What now? Now, Elizabeth replied. We eat. We talk. We listen, just like Dad wanted. And tomorrow? Michael asked, his tone suggesting he was genuinely open to the answer. Tomorrow, Jamie said quietly, we start figuring out what this new version of the Harrison family might look like. If that's what you all want. Michael studied her for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time not an interloper or a threat, but another piece of the complicated legacy Richard Harrison had left behind. I think, he said finally, that's exactly what Dad was hoping for. Outside, the last light of day gilded the snow-covered landscape in gold and rose. Inside, around the table Richard Harrison had gathered his family around for decades, his children began the slow, challenging work of building something new from the foundation he had left them, flawed, imperfect, but ultimately strong enough to bear the weight of their shared future.